record button now. Okay, so welcome everyone. We're really excited about today's session. Doug and I have had a little conversation and I've given him a warning that I tend to talk far too much. So he's more than welcome to cut me off. And in fact, in this first half an hour where we're hoping it'll be a little more interactive and take on a little more conversational tone, that folks will be able to pitch in as we go on. But in order to get us kicked off, I'm just going to share my screen. So we've got a little presentation prepared to help us keep things going. Oh, full screen. Oh no, that's not right. All right, so I'll maybe keep the screen like this so that we can see it. All right, so we're going to be talking about introducing writing realities today, and so we'll get into the framework itself later on in the session. Like I said, I think Doug and I are keen on having this kind of conversational approach and working with the doing as well as the thinking about what we're doing. That sounds very meta, but we'll start off actually with a little introduction to ourselves. So Doug, do you want to start or?
Well, sure. Thank you. Welcome. And I'll try to be quick because we do want to hear from you and we actually want to get you writing today. This morning really set us up for that. I just had such a fabulous time listening to our speakers, but I think they really spoke to identities as writers. And so part of thinking and about identity and sharing identity has to do with sharing our whole lives with our students and our colleagues. And so we put a few little identifiers for each of us. I am right now in Storrs, Connecticut, about 110 miles away north of New York City right now. The sun has come up now. I started this conference in the dark. I teach at the University of Connecticut, and I teach and study writers and writing particularly. We may get into my twisted family tree where we have all sorts of marriages and blended families, and I write about that a lot. I love New York, and my daughter just got into graduate school in New York, so I'm living vicariously through her. A lot of my work recently has brought me into the realm of advocacy, looking at diverse learners in our schools and how we advocate for them through lenses of equity and social justice, in particular anti-racism. And I run a program that focuses on those things where we bring people from the States to Cape Town, South Africa, and they work there in township schools and learn how to remove some of their prejudices and look through a different lens at children. I come historically from Britain and Western Europe, and so I have an affinity. I love being over in your country. I'm going to stop because I want Navan to go. Theater major has really defined who I am and how I interact, I think. And then I love to run, and I'm from the state of New Mexico in the western part of the United States. And so out of all of those things, I could talk forever, but I'm going to stop and welcome Navan.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much. I think so. The idea behind this was definitely that we're made up of so many different things. And each of these things is a lens to how we see the world and how we experience the world, and who we are, and therefore how we can place ourselves in the world. So like Doug, I'll talk about just a few of the kind of identity categories that I think I occupy. So my name is Navan Govender. I'm originally from South Africa. I'm probably like second, third generation Indian, South African. Moved to Glasgow and now live in Glasgow and work at the University of Strathclyde as a lecturer. I run the English part of the program, of the PGDE program at the university there. And I've been so in terms of work and in terms of my life, I think I've been drawn very much into the research and the practice of critical literacies. So how language and meaning making intersect with identity and culture and history and power are really deep interests of mine. And this is probably stemmed from my kind of hybrid identity of being, you know, an English-speaking Indian South African living in the UK. You know, there's being a queer person, all of these things, being a binge watcher, someone who has this kind of OCD tendency to have to watch everything in one go. And so all of these things, I think, as we'll see, get pinned down into not only our ways of reading and making meaning in that sense in the world, but also in the ways we write and the kinds of ways I think I myself, as an example, maybe try to assert myself in different spaces as a teacher, as a researcher, as a human. And so, you know, we're hoping that this kind of prompt will help us think through the ideas about teaching writing today. So maybe Doug, if you're happy, we could move straight into this next little activity. Do you want to talk us through the writing territories?
Sure. Writing territories came from a brilliant teacher named Nancy Atwell. Some of you may have heard her name if you follow sort of workshop and process writing work out of the States. She won the initial Barney Teacher Award, which comes with the $1 million prize and is considered to be the Nobel of Teaching. In 2015, she was the first winner of that. And I've done some research in her school to see how she sets things up and what she does and what the concepts of writing realities are mesh seamlessly. And on the first day of class, she sits with her students and she talks about how writers find ideas. And she gives them this sheet that has some prompts on it that for the reluctant writer or the writer who doesn't know where to start, just gives a little anchor. This is a very low stakes environment right now where she just wants children to get words down on the page. And she walks them through some of these things that they might think about arising out of their own life and then says, write on something. It doesn't matter whether it's quality, but it matters that it's something that comes from you and that you care about. And you can write on one of these things or a number of these things, but this is just a prompt to get you going. We're going to write for 15 minutes and then we're going to talk about what came out. You can share your writing, or you could just share what happened as you were writing. Now, I don't know if we're giving exactly 15 minutes, Navan. I can't remember how much we timed, but what we'd like you to do is take a look at this slide here, and maybe it gives rise to something that you think is important for you to write about for yourself and maybe would be important to share with others.
Yeah, so maybe let's work with about 10 minutes. So I'll just stop sharing the screen for a moment. What we'd like you to do, so think of this as a really short free writing task. You're welcome to switch your cameras off if you want to. You might want to take a few minutes to think about and look at the prompts. In the chat, I've just released the Padlet link. So the prompts, so the writing territory prompts are there if you want to refer back to them. So have a think of, which one speaks to you. You might want to have a little wonder around where you are at the moment. Are there objects or things or places or people around you at the moment that might prompt you to write, and take at least 2 minutes of the next 10 minutes to write solidly. It is free writing, which means that write everything that you're thinking, whether you think it makes sense or not, whether you think it sounds beautiful or not, or correct or not. And then if we join back at 10:02, so
Yeah.
1.
All right.
And feel free to add your writing, if you're willing to share, add your writing to the Padlet page. And we're hoping to share and get some conversation going around that. All right, so we'll give you 10 minutes. I'll stop recording in the meantime. Record again. Okay, so thank you, everyone. It's just the stories and sometimes even just the questions that are raised on the Padlet are fascinating. And so maybe we'd like to, I'll just share my screen again so that we can look at the next slide. So we were talking a little bit about these writing territories, this idea that we all start from somewhere. And, when we start thinking about the way writing is taught and how it's used in the classroom, the question that we asked was, how is it that we get into writing? How, what's the purpose of it? How is it connected to who we are? And so how do we move beyond, potentially the dominance of potentially technical approaches to writing, and where does the technical kind of fit within all of this stuff? The idea of how is writing actually used, and what is meaning making for, and who does it serve? So maybe we could, and Doug, feel free to interject here, but maybe we want to have a little chat about the process. So this is just a little taster of kind of getting to grips with this idea of writing realities, again, which will hopefully pin down into a more formal kind of framework. But I think we both kind of work from the idea that to theorize, or that all the theory and kind of research work that exists is about trying to understand what actually happens in the world and the way these things are actually done. And so working from practice and working from this, from doing writing is maybe we're hoping is a useful starting point. So we'd like you to think about like, what is it that you did? So which of the prompts spoke to you? Why? What moved you to write? And how did what were the feelings, I guess, attached to that? So was it difficult to put the words down? Did you find yourself maybe policing the words that you were putting down? Did it make a difference that you were writing on the Padlet or on a piece of paper, or that you knew we were hoping that you would share? Did you feel compelled to share? So I'll stop sharing, and maybe just by like a show of hands, if anyone wants to respond, you're also welcome to put down your responses into the chat if you're keen on that.
Don't mind going first.
Cool, Richard, go ahead.
It was one of your sort of that spider diagram sort of points on binge watching. And I think from you talking about that, and then kind of, I've just binge watched a whole series last night, and it's the idea of trying to kind of not watch the whole thing. I wanted to sort of separate it up, and it was the It's a Sin, which I sort of didn't know about. There's a lot of sort of learning that I've done from that. And I think it just made me reflect from lockdown, kind of my experience of reading has kind of, I found it quite tricky to focus on that. And I think that sort of the binge watching has allowed me to go out of my kind of four walls and experience kind of other things. So I've looked at sort of series which have had like 5 or 6 seasons, and then other ones where it's just like 5 episodes. But it just made me reflect on that and what I've got from it. And I think it ultimately left me feeling like I've got a lot of reading to do at the end of all of this, and kind of exploring things that I don't know much about. But it's been a really interesting process to put it down on the page. And I think most interesting, I hate writing whilst everyone can see it. So I did mine in notes and then pasted it in at the very end. So it's interesting to think of that as a process. So, yeah.
Okay, nice, right? So, and I think that's really interesting. So suddenly there's also the idea of using writing as a potential for exploring beyond yourself. And we'll pick up on this as well, this idea of like cross-modal work, right? So texts and meanings are maybe pinned to words sometimes, and we tend to value that most, but actually we're taking in the world and experiencing it and making sense of it in so many different ways. So, using a TV show to reflect on who we are and where we are and what we think is really interesting. And it's all connected. Matthew, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. I wrote on, this is awesome, by the way. I wrote from risk because I was scared. And just when you put the reflection up, I said, face it, confront it, distill it, dare, dynamic, police, swearing on a Saturday. And then I said, save, share, compel. I did a one-man show in 2018, and it's been opened up to a cast of 8. And I had to be brave about that dialogue is not of my flesh anymore. It belongs to 8 other characters. And that's a risk because it's not me being in control. Death of the author. That's it.
All right, brilliant. I love that the risk, again, this idea of putting meaning out into the world. I think that's where a lot of the apprehension maybe comes from, is this, having others know what you're thinking or who you are, and that kind of exposure. And it's also, when we imprint anything onto a text, and we put it out into the world, we lose control over how it's going to be used and how it's going to be perceived, so that kind of tension between intended meaning and realized meaning, and actual social impact. So, but then, I guess this starting to raise questions about, well, hold on, what does this mean in terms of identity and equity? If we're thinking about, the social impact of texts, how is writing, is it productive to police ourselves, to not let those ideas and not understand the impact of the ideas that we're sharing and how we're putting those together? Or is it more beneficial to experiment in those ways? Sorry, Doug, I'm totally taking up space. So do add in, and again, just by show of hands, if anyone else wants to add in.
I will note, first of all, that a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. First of all, Richard, you went beyond the writing territories sheet that we gave you and actually used that previous slide as a writing territory. And I think that fits so well with the keynote this morning, where we were talking about, where Piers was talking about being attentive, and you're looking like a writer and noting something that resonated with you from your life in the binging that gave rise to a topic. And that I talk about those things with children in my college age students all the time, that noticing and grabbing it when it's there. And Matthew, your willingness to invest in your fear and take those risks from it turns into a lesson, a conversational lesson with children right away. If you're modeling those things as a writer, as opposed to a teacher, and saying, this is what I'm doing here, and this is the risk I'm taking, all of a sudden risks become possible for children. So I just loved the way you framed that. And I'll stop there.
All right, nice. Mia, before we get to you, I just wanted to make a quick response to, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, Atika Ali. Your comment about emotions, problems and sorrows, life journey for migrants of war-torn countries, especially at critical points of emotional development, and then the link to William Blake's A Poison Tree. So again, this idea of intertextuality, but again, that statement that we had on that slide, where, we all start from somewhere, we all come from somewhere. We'll talk a little bit about what that means for an asset-based approach, which is what this Writing Realities kind of takes on. It is recognizing that the particular lenses that we view the world are assets. They give us insight into ourselves and insight into the way others see the same situations or experience the world in very different ways. and so I do really appreciate that perspective, right? Gaining alternative perspectives. Mia, do you want to go ahead?
I just want to say something quickly, which is what I found really interesting is that I just took one of the words, so it was understandings, and I just kind of treated it as a word, so it was kind of the first thing I wrote, and then explored like the meaning of what understanding meant. But I just thought, I don't know, where I went with that wasn't what I expected, and I thought it was great that I could just write literally just from my idea of a word. I thought it was a great idea.
Yeah, nice, right? So again, it's the like where do what counts as a story? Sometimes it's and what triggers stories. I think that's brilliant. That sometimes it makes me think of the lithiometer from His Dark Materials. It's that whole process of there's a little symbol, but there's like a million billion meanings underneath, and actually it's how you engage with it. It's your state of mind and what you see and what you're unable to see at that point in time that certain meanings are realized or not. So much of it is based on context, so much of it is based on who you are, on the again what you're able to see, but also the limitations of what we're able to see because of who we are and where we are in space and time. So I'm just thinking the session is flying by already, and there's just like tons of information in the chat and on the Padlet, and I think we could talk for days. So Doug, do you want to add anything before we maybe move into start talking through the writing realities framework itself?
Why don't we move forward and talk about those fundamental concepts and how they fit in? And I think that we'll immediately begin to see how some of the work that's already been done here intersects with them. And that's really the important thing, is to see that there is, even if you're just writing as teachers and you don't think a lot about theory all the time, if you're doing it with an identity of a writer, you are beginning to touch on the theories. And so I think it'll be interesting to talk about that. So.
Okay, brilliant. So we'll come back to potentially come back to this definition, but we'll make these available, and the recording will be available, so you could probably just access this and pause it. So let's look at the writing realities kind of framework, right? So I think what we've tried to do is bring together what are often interconnected, but often interconnected kind of fields or areas and approaches, but often considered and studied and practiced, sometimes in isolation. So we're looking at, working with writer identity and thinking about that very carefully. Culturally sustainable pedagogies. So, again, there's drawing on an asset-based approach where, we recognize that learners are stepping into the classroom with ideas, with lives, with experiences, with interests, and that is fundamentally the starting point. So I guess it's related to the access paradox that actually critical literacies talks about, where how you enable learners access to powerful forms of using language, so powerful genres and powerful varieties of language, such as standardized English, whilst really acknowledging and drawing on their ways of using language and experiencing it from their own kind of communities and cultural backgrounds. Then we work across multiliteracies and intertextualities, so understanding that there are a variety of ways of making meaning, and that meaning itself is intertextual. So it comes from the connections that we or our learners are able to make in relation to the text that they know. And often those are culturally based, those are community based, those are linked to their identities, so there's this kind of matrix of identity, culture, and meaning. And so it's from a writing realities perspective, it's how do we navigate those spaces in order to engage learners in both work in working with writing as a kind of formal curriculum and school requirement, but also as a way of engaging with their identities and what are the significant effects of that, you know, both in attainment and like kind of cognitive development, but also in kind of social, cultural value as well. So Doug, do you want to add in? Sorry. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on
There we
mute.
go.
There we go.
There we go. I have too many things open, and I was reading some of the chats. So yeah, I think, you know, as we begin to do this work in classroom, for me, it's always been important to think primarily about writer identity and who we are as writers, and then how we bring our identities either as writers or as non-writers who are trying to come into it. And then if we are thinking in the ways of a writer, these other aspects, the critical literacy aspect, the multiliteracy aspect, the need to look at what we're doing in the classroom as culturally sustainable almost come along, because that the identity of a writer is expansive, and it celebrates diversity, and it looks across different aspects of the world. I mean, you started doing this already. You didn't just take our directions and say, I'm going to do this one thing. You were looking across your entire life, and that intertextuality then starts to build. We begin to re-envision what it means to be a writer, and it's not always words on a page. It's any mode of making meaning that goes through a process of thought, reflection, expression, discussion, and those types of things. So for the practicing teacher, I think distilling this down at the beginning, and this is just me talking, and Navan can start disagreeing with me too. I always encourage focusing in on who am I as a writer? How can I bring my writing life into the classroom? And then share that in a way that children can begin to establish their own identities as writers by seeing the possibilities we bring up and then moving beyond them.
Hmm. Well, I think I completely agree with that. It's this, so a part of what I think the writing realities approach maybe allows us to see is how do we construct an environment where that kind of engagement becomes possible? And in order for it to become possible, it means that teachers are constructing classroom spaces and discussions where we can talk about, you know, both the affordances and the difficulties of different writing practices. And so because then writing or meaning making, as I think you said correctly, like it is a constant ongoing practice. And so that moving between, you know, creating a bit of meaning, you know, being inspired by something, having a short bit of writing, finding a text, talking about it, understanding, well, how does this fit? Does it work? How are others responding to it? And I think just in this more like the early parts of today's session, just the Padlet of, you know, folks writing on paper first, you know, thinking, then deciding what to put onto the Padlet, maybe writing on the Padlet, deleting, and then posting, you know, all of those processes help us understand where power lies and how often, or maybe in classrooms, if we're not careful, we only ever look at the finished products of what texts should look like. But that experience of embedding it into everyday classroom practice, into recognizing how writing fits into everyday classroom practice, and how it's an ongoing process of negotiation, can be a powerful thing. And that learners are often making decisions about what to include and what to exclude, and what to share and what not to share, all the time.
Navan, I'm looking at the time flying by. I can't believe how quick it is. Should we move on and show some examples here? that sort of illustrate the things we're talking about?
Yeah, all right. So I'll talk through this example really quickly, and I'll share a link because I did write a short kind of blog post about this. So the materials and kind of a little more discussion is available. But so I run the PGDE English kind of component or program at the University of Strathclyde, and every year students and I kind of we do an outdoor learning activity where we walk down to what's called the Dalton Fountain, and it's in Glasgow, Glasgow Green, which is right next, well, within walking distance of the main city centre. And so again, going back to my identity as a foreigner in the UK, as you know, as someone with South Asian heritage, coming from South Africa, and I guess this year more pertinently than ever with the rise of the call for decolonization and Black Lives Matter, this fountain stood out as a really interesting object, and this kind of imprint of old empire in what is increasingly becoming a more kind of super diverse city. So students and I go out and they have a series of activities which is available. I've laid it all out. They have to do a critical discourse analysis. So using a series of activities, they end up doing a critical discourse analysis of this artifact. And so we do have to talk about coloniality. We have to talk about heteronormativity. We have to talk about environment. And so we have to almost rethink or position ourselves in relation to this particular artifact. And so students go through a process of collecting and producing texts. And in that, they resist the ideas that are presented in the course, but some of them take up some certain ideas. One of the activities is that students need to redesign the museum plaque. So in other words, they're asked to rewrite it and think about, well, how do we get a broader audience or, you know, just passers-by to engage with this artifact in more critical ways? You know, what kinds of stories are we telling? Or do these artifacts tell? And so you can see some, you know, in this particular example, they've made decisions about, you know, what information to include about the actual artifact. But rather than just presenting information, they've raised a series of questions, which means that they've repositioned. So they've redesigned the way the public might interact with this kind of text, right? In red, I've highlighted the kinds of questions that they're asking. So, you know, they're asking questions about whose interests are served, you know, what are the possible alternative perspectives, you know, who gets represented and misrepresented. So redesign from a writing realities approach means that folks can respond to the texts around them. But significantly, some students are taken up and moved to write. So here's a poem by one of the students, Melanie Quince, who's asked to be named, called Nobody Cares to Look Up. And so this is a student who then opted to produce a creative piece, almost reasserting herself in this space. So talking about her gender, her ethnicity, her sitting or kind of experiencing the artifact in space. Again, it's this assertion of identity. And it may be problematic, it may not be. You know, there might be resistances to reading this, but this was the starting point for something where a student or a person felt that they could speak and speak in very particular ways. So I'll give you like a second to read it, and then we'll move on to the next example. There's a ton more that I feel like I could say about this, but the idea is that, you know, writing then became a way to assert their own identities and reposition themselves in very significant ways. Okay. And then Doug, over to you.
Yes, and I'm going to connect this back to the writing you just did too. This is an example from a teacher who was one of my students who then has gone on to an illustrious career. She was a non-writer when she came into the program and then decided to write for herself. And during her student teaching, instead of using examples of poetry from books, she said, I want to share my writing process. And this is a poem she wrote where she was playing around with a lot of different conventions. And so this whole poem could turn into 50 different mini lessons, focusing in on different craft elements and the process she went through and all those things. Nicole Satajay, the teacher, when she was born, her mother was 15 years old. And so she was raised by her grandmother, and her mother almost became like an older sister. And out of this experience and talking with people about her life, she remembered the play she used to have with her mother. And you can read this as I'm speaking right now, but they used to have a race every day to get to the bathroom in time, and it just turned into grand fun. What was so important about this is she brought this into what we call a mini lesson, but shared it as a writer. Her identity as a writer was paramount rather than her trying to teach something. She did talk about where her ideas came from. She talked about what she was trying to do with the thump, ba-bump, ba-bump going down the stairs. And so there were so many things that just came into this very natural, organic conversation. And what's important about this is when she introduced this, the kids were very attentive. But it didn't mean that she gave an assignment afterwards. Nevertheless, what happened was several kids in the class found some sort of connection, whether it be emotional, affective, academic, stylistic connection to this particular poem, and made it into their own. And one of the examples is in the next slide. A little girl, Maya, who's 8 years old, without any prompting from the teacher, went back into a writer's notebook and started writing, because in this class, workshop was purely about free choice. Children got to choose the topics, they got to choose the genres. And so you could see how much Nicole influenced Maya when she writes, one day I woke up and my sister woke up right after me, and we could hear each other's stomachs rumble, and we knew what that meant. Off the covers flying through the air and made a silent thud on the ground as we raced to the stairs. I slide down the banister so it would be faster than her running down the stair. I jump off even though there's still quite a way to go. I didn't want to take the risk of Olivia beating me to the kitchen. I was dashing, running, sprinting. So while she didn't take poetic form, this is more of a narrative, the tone and the intention and the excitement was there because Nicole's story personally resonated with her. And that's what we're trying to create, is an environment of writers in the classroom where kids, I wouldn't call this plagiarism. I would call it what writers do all the time. And you saw Piers sort of taking this on as he's looking through all these different books about hares this morning and then synthesizing them into something that's wholly his own. So for me, this is illustrative of a workshop environment, a writing realities environment that is working because the establishment of identities is there and people are working in conjunction together, listening to one another, talking, stealing from one another. And so I just thought that was a beautiful example of what could happen. I don't know where we are. Okay, I do know where we are in terms of time right now. We could quickly go to the next one, or if Navan, you think it'd be more important for us to have a little chat, I'm complete. Yeah, and that's just the end of Maya's there.
Yeah.
Her dad made pancakes.
Okay. Well, I think we could possibly share the slides
Yeah.
with folks as well. So these texts, you could potentially get to read them in a little more detail as well. Okay. I guess maybe if we want to, we could talk a little because we've probably got about 10 minutes left. So it'd be nice to get some, questions or even comments and ideas. All right. I've just noticed that there's some folks who might not have had access to the Padlet. So here's the Padlet link one more time. We will keep it active. So if you want to revisit some of the writing and comment and kind of keep the conversation going, that would be really great. A couple of things to mention before we get folks to speak is that so Writing Realities was also kind of is an extension of, like, a response to, as well as building off of the Reflecting Realities project. So we recognize that there's a process, or at least there's significant work being done that looks at what learners have access to and the kinds of texts and stories and identities that learners can access. And so the question then was raised about, well, how many opportunities do learners have to construct and produce and assert their identities and their stories? And so the role of writing is we're hoping to shift the gaze a little, but we're recognizing that reading and writing binary is a false binary. We need to work across meaning making in different ways. So we're hoping to put that across as well. Yeah, and so ultimately it's about really consolidating a range of fields. So there's a great deal of work that already exists, and I think that's kind of coming together in our framework, and we've got some handouts that we'll make available at some point. Hopefully maybe after the conference, we'll see if we can send a version of that. So it's building off of that, but it's trying to consolidate them and see how they work in relation to each other, and how those connections help us potentially realize new practices and build on the practices that might already exist, as well as innovate in different ways. All right. So I guess in questions or comments, I've taken up even more time. Cool. Matthew.
Yes, can you hear me? Is that right? Yeah, just two texts. With year 10, Stephen Kelman's Pidgin English, and with year 9, we did In the Sea There Are Crocodiles. What you talked about colonialism, they both address issues like that and giving them a voice. But also in terms of the UK, in London, where we are, the social economic context for those plays are real. 3 years ago, a kid did get murdered. Students coming from Sri Lanka, been in the country 2 weeks. He's English, what's going to happen there? But I just think imaginatively, and this idea of for me, it's always going to be the 2 T's. It's about how does this transcend? How does this transform? And that comes through being quite savvy and subversive in the classroom with that identity of creating pockets of liminal spaces, so that creepy crawly of creativity can come through the cracks. And I can only substantiate it if I quote the Victor Turner, and if I quote the Joseph Campbell ideas about the hero, what's their hero. So it's really deep, and it's emotional, and it's powerful, and I want to know more theories so I can anchor back off. We're doing it. Look at what they're doing. It's very powerful to create that protection of this new space. How do you do that? That's it.
So yeah, so it's probably an ongoing process. I know with the students, we work from an intersectional perspective. So in other words, we're again drawing on this asset-based approach. We're trying to recognize different kinds of identities and therefore different kinds of oppressions. So how do we experience marginality and privilege in different ways, and how does that give us access into other perspectives? And so so when we spoke about so part of the work that my students have been doing is that they go through the city and they take photographs, for instance, and so they find texts written in Scots. They take photographs, and then they talk about how that monument is also positioned in the center, or at least just across the river from one of the most deprived areas of Glasgow. So you've got this monument to empire and to to resources, this idea of having power and money and resources. And just across there, you've got impoverished kind of communities. So just by revealing some of those, and they do that through photography, and then they write about it, but they access those ideas through different ways. And sometimes it's very simple. So it might be a little piece of writing, but it gets a conversation going, and it means that they go and do some reading, and it builds up in those ways. Doug, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I'm just looking at the chat, and Anne said, can we use or can we empower children and young people's voices to justify these subversive activities? And yes, I think that is at the heart of what we're doing here. The slide that we don't have time for, but I'll speak to very briefly, shows some writing from a child in a classroom that is in a low-income district in the United States. The children are almost exclusively Black or Latinx students, and they've been working off a traditional curriculum. It didn't really give credence to their own backgrounds until this wonderful teacher, Tracy Lafayette, took over and pretty much turned the entire curriculum around a hub of activism, where she began to ask the children, what's important to you and what do we want to change? And her entire classroom library is filled with books that cover issues of activism and social justice and human rights and LGBTQ+ rights. And these kids who are 7 and 8 years old are learning about these things now, and then being empowered to use writing and use their voices to make change. And in fact, these small children were the ones in their town to write to the town council and insist that what we call our Columbus Day be changed to Indigenous Peoples Day as a part of the official holiday of the town. And after about a year of work, it worked. So their activism actually has turned into results there. And when we say your voice matters and you have ideas that are important to share with other people, they begin to see what the possibilities are. And of course, writing then becomes much more relevant than it was before when we were giving them the assignment. We're having them use their writing in authentic ways to try to make change. And so it's really, really powerful. And I thank you for bringing that up.
Brilliant. I don't know if there are any other, we've got like 3 minutes left. Any other questions or comments? I think there's some in the chat. Gabrielle.
Hi, yes. Just very interesting, all of this. Just thinking about the fact that a lot of our initial teacher education takes place in urban areas. And there are, of course, equally pressing issues for children of all ages, including adolescents growing up in rural areas. And I don't know whether either of you have experiences of where writing with young people in rural areas has been particularly effective, or whether that's something that we all just need to work on more, and which working outdoors, I do think is a really good way to do that wherever you are. Thanks.
Thanks. Doug, do you want to add anything, or I know Seth worked. Yeah.
Well, I live in a rural area that's on the edge of several different suburban areas, so you can drive 20 minutes and be in the middle of a city. Nevertheless, it's a farming community, and many of the issues are similar and many are different. There is high poverty in a lot of our districts around here that people don't necessarily acknowledge, but what works is opening ourselves up to finding out children's and community members' realities by creating a curriculum where we're asking the question, who are you and what can you teach me? And that runs across any district anywhere. And once you do that, then you have something concrete to which to respond that is relevant. And so I think that that's the thing, especially at the beginning of the year, opening the curriculum up, not to just feeding the content, but to saying, who are we as a community? I need to know who you are before I can respond to you in the appropriate way. And I've learned much more about rural life since I've moved here by doing that than I otherwise would. And I'm constantly learning.
Mm. Nice. I just saw a comment in the chat saying that we might have the link, these rooms open until 22, so we might have an extra 10 minutes if we want to keep the chat going. I wanted to say I have worked with teachers in across the Highlands here in Scotland, and it's the same kind of question, you know, and I think in the Writing Realities framework, we've spoken a little bit about, you know, so what happens when you step into communities or spaces or classrooms that are relatively homogenous, and how do you engage with that? And I think that's where the critical kind of participation of teachers does, you know, becomes quite important, because again, you know, when we chat to teachers, we talk about not being able to escape. So as teachers, not being able to escape that role as a gatekeeper. You make decisions about what learners have access to and what gets valued. And of course, I mean, we also work within that space where we're told what's valued and what's not, and what decisions we're allowed to make. So it's not to say that you know, that's all kind of in the ideal scenario, but as those within that kind of role as gatekeepers, we can think about, you know, across a learner's a year of schooling, across a period, so across, you know, early years or primary or going into secondary, across whole curriculums, how many opportunities do learners get to access stories and experiences of the world and understandings of the world that are not their own? And then how many opportunities do they get to express their own experiences of the world? And I think that's, you know, kind of, if we start asking those questions in those ways, then we can start thinking about, well, how are we accessing and how are we learning, enabling learners to consume and produce meanings in different ways and from different places? Because I think fundamentally what that means is that there's an underlying recognition from us as teachers that what makes it into the curriculum is only a fraction of the knowledge and perspectives available in the world. So how do we broaden that even in little ways? And I think bringing in learners' voices is definitely a way of doing that, because the experiences in our classrooms will invariably be more diverse than we think they are. Yeah.
This is making me think as well about an incident that happened with me a couple of years ago, where I was in a district in a school that was almost exclusively white, and there had been some incidents of racism. And in talking with the principal, what we call the principal over here, I said, well, I'm looking around the school. I don't see a lot of diverse literature. I don't see a lot of talk about people other than, you know, this racial group here. And he said, well, in this district, we don't need to worry about that because we're all white. And I said, well, you need to worry about it more than anybody. And so, yeah, I think that that's another layer of this notion of identity, is we start with where we are and we celebrate children's identities and actually have them start thinking about things like racial and ethnic identity, which if you're in a dominant race, we hide from, and we don't have to look at other things. But we start there. Who am I as a person, as a thinker, as a white person? And then who are the people that we've conveniently been able to ignore? And so if you're, depending on you know, the racial makeup of your own districts, you want to think about how you can enrich your classroom libraries with scores of books about other people and talk about them. And then that leads into writing that brings up new questions and invites other people in. So it's not, when we're talking about identity, we're not just talking about this is my own little enclosed world. We talk about identity so that we begin to understand how to celebrate others' identities.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, the thing is, so I'm just looking at I think it's Rianne Snag, your comment about, you know, the idea of things being political. And I remember going to a meeting the one day, and being told that I need to stop making education political, and through these comments. And so but my response was, but hold on, education is always political. So even in these everyday stories of who gets to tell their stories, how we use, you know, the feedback given from learners, you know, how I talk to students about, you know, just that move from, you know, when a child speaks, when a young person speaks, and we write it up on the board and we say, oh, that's a really good idea, everyone copy it down. There's a significant value system that's at play there. And there's a significant shift in power and identity. And so the question is, when and how do those things all work in combination? You know, we're talking about like diversity for, you know, working in Scotland. There's a lot of, you know, one of the things that we talk about, and that I, you know, hopefully is a way for the folks that I get to work with to see how different kinds of oppression are connected, and therefore to develop this kind of empathy and ways of understanding different kinds of oppression is, you know, we talk a little bit about Scots language and where that sits in the curriculum, how teachers, our student teachers, get reprimanded for speaking bad English all the time, and yet, you know, so how is that kind of linguistic, the power around language and language variety, how does that affect what kinds of stories make it into the classroom? And the fact that, you know, we've done an activity where our students have to write a dialogue in youth varieties and then perform it in front of the class. And that is a tough task. Invariably those scenes are very short because it takes a long time for some folks to feel like they can actually write in Scots or write in non-standard varieties of English, and then to have to perform it is another big kind of hurdle to jump over. But if as adults, if we feel like, oh, we can't write in these playful ways, we can't mix and work across the different language varieties that we probably all have, a lot of us have, this kind of fallacy of, you know, strict monolingualism, then how do we draw on all of those repertoires of what, you know, all those words that we do know, and how do we use that to enrich the way we write and we speak and we think? So there's some fascinating stuff out there, and it's those little things. I think it's a combination of those little things that build into a culture, that build into, you know, shifting the value systems. So some of it is very risky. Yes, you know, talking about, you know, decoloniality and race and ethnicity and those politics, you know, we might not want to face it, but there are ways into it. And these are also the conversations and the identities that exist. So how do we bring all of those identities together? How do we recognize the limits of our own identities? And then therefore, how do we start to reposition diversity as a way of, oh, this is something that I wouldn't be able to typically see. This is, you know, I need others in order to gain a fuller understanding of what it's like, what the world is, what's possible.
We may be cut off at 9:40. We may just disappear. So I wanted to say thank you to all of you. And I hope we can continue the conversation. We can send you out our contact information. in case we get cut off. So I don't know if there's a place, I'm sure Ross will lead us to a place where we can get a list of participants. And if you ever want to have a conversation, I'd love to learn what you're doing in your own classrooms.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. The next step for the Writing Realities kind of framework is to hopefully work collaboratively with all kinds of folks to see, you know, if we pull all these ideas together, what does that mean for practice, and how is it realized, and how do we build on what's already being done? Brilliant stories. First of all, thank you so much for contributing to the Padlet. It will be up, so do, you know, when you have time, keep revisiting and commenting and keep the conversation going, and then hopefully we will get to see everyone soon. All right, ciao.